You actually think I owe you money?" Terrence Holt set the folder on the counter and laughed the way men laugh when they've already decided the meeting is over. "We dumped scrap iron on the edge of your property for 15 years because nobody wanted it. You should be thanking us for the free delivery." The young man on the other side of the counter didn't move. His hands were resting flat on the glass, calloused at the knuckles, dark with old grease that soap hadn't fully reached. He looked at the folder, then at Terrence Holt, then at the folder again. "I have," Tobias Greer said, "been thanking you for 15 years. He pushed a second document across the counter. "Now I'm done." To understand what was in that document, you have to go back to the summer Tobias was 9 years old. That was 2010, the year the Caldwell fabrication plant on Route 7 outside Harwick, Georgia started running 3 shifts instead of 2. Caldwell made structural components, brackets, flanges, custom mounting hardware for industrial equipment. The machines that cut and stamped and pressed the steel were precise. Their byproduct was not. Every run left behind iron offcuts, short lengths, irregular shapes, pieces too small to return to the floor and too varied to bundle for resale. The plant's accounting department classified them under a line item called production residuals. Getting rid of them cost the company $900 a month, paid to a licensed hauler who came twice a week and took it all to a recycling facility 30 miles south. The Carter family, Tobias's family, had owned the 2.8 acres adjacent to the plant's western loading dock since 1953. Tobias's grandfather, a man named Amos Greer, had bought it from a farmer who was selling everything he had and leaving for Memphis. Amos paid $400. He built a house on the front acre and left the rest of the land as it was, a long flat strip of Georgia red clay running alongside what was then a cotton storage facility and would become, 40 years later, a fabrication plant with a $12 million annual revenue. By the time Tobias was old enough to understand what the plant was, Amos was gone. His grandmother, Ruth Greer, lived alone in the house at the front of the property. She worked 4 days a week at a dry cleaning operation on the edge of town, and spent her evenings watching the news with the volume too high because her hearing had been going since her 60s and she refused to admit it. Tobias's mother had died when he was 3. A stroke, fast, the kind that doesn't give you time to prepare. His father, a man Tobias remembered mostly as a smell, motor oil and mentholated cough drops, had left the year after and not come back. So it was Ruth who raised him, Ruth who packed his lunch, Ruth who sat in the folding chair at the back of the school gymnasium during his 5th grade science fair, and told anyone who would listen that her grandson was going to be an engineer. She meant it the way grandmothers mean things, as a wish more than a prediction. The prediction, it turned out, was more accurate than either of them knew. The summer Tobias was 9, the Caldwell plant changed its waste protocol. A new floor manager named Dale Coburn decided the hauler was too expensive and the schedule too irregular. His solution was simple. They had a strip of unused land running along the west fence. They could stage the scrap there, let it accumulate for a month, and run a single larger pickup instead of 2 smaller ones. Coburn didn't own that strip of land. He assumed it was part of the plant property because nobody had ever told him otherwise, and he didn't look it up. So on a Thursday morning in July 2010, a forklift operator named Pete carried 3 bins of iron offcuts through the back gate and dumped them along the fence line on the Greer side of the property. He stacked them loosely the way you stack things you don't intend to keep and went back to his shift. Tobias was sitting on the back porch when it happened. He watched the forklift move through the gate. He watched Pete dump the bins. He watched Pete leave. Then he walked over and looked at what had been left. Short lengths of flat bar, angle iron, some of it still warm from the press, pieces of square tube in 3 different sizes, round stock, thick as his thumb. Everything was sharp-edged, rust-free, clean from the manufacturing process. He picked up a length of flat bar, turned it in his hands, set it down. He went inside and found his grandmother watching the news. "There's iron over by the fence," he said. "A lot of it." Ruth muted the television. "What kind of iron?" "Steel, I think. Like from the plant." She looked at him for a moment. "Leave it alone," she said. "It's probably a mistake." It was not a mistake. 3 weeks later, Pete came back with another load. Tobias didn't leave it alone. He started spending his afternoons at the fence line, watching the plant. He learned the rhythm of it. The forklift came on Thursdays, sometimes Tuesdays. Pete would dump 2 or 3 bins, never look over his shoulder, and drive back in. By September, the pile along the fence was chest high on a 9-year-old. Tobias carried pieces to the back of the yard. Not all of it, just the pieces he thought were interesting. Lengths he could lift, flat stock that looked like it might become something. He had no tools and no plan. He just couldn't watch it sit there going to rust. His grandmother found the small pile he'd assembled behind the garden shed. "You dragged all this back here, yourself?" "Some of it." She looked at it, looked at him. She did not say, "Throw it away." What she said was, "Your grandfather used to say that good material finds its way to the right hands eventually." She went back inside. The matter was settled in the way things in that house got settled, quietly, with no further discussion. That winter, Ruth found an old welding manual at the church rummage sale. She paid 50 cents for it and left it on Tobias's pillow without explanation. He read it 3 times. The following spring, with money he'd saved from walking dogs for 2 neighbors, he bought a used flux core welder from a man selling tools out of his truck at the feed store parking lot. It didn't come with instructions. He figured it out. The first time he struck an arc in the backyard, the flash was brighter than he expected and he didn't have a helmet, so he looked away and welded blind for the first 30 seconds. The bead was terrible. He cut it off with a hacksaw and tried again. He kept the ruined welds in a coffee can. He wasn't sure why. They just felt like something he shouldn't throw away. By the time Tobias was 12, the pile at the fence had grown to a size that neighbors on the county road had started commenting on. Ruth heard about it at the dry cleaner. She came home that evening and walked the full length of the back property for the first time in years. She didn't say anything while she walked. When she got back to the porch, she sat down in the good chair, the one that didn't wobble, and looked at her grandson. "People are talking," she said. "I know. What are you going to do with all of it?" "I don't know yet." "Then you better figure it out before I do." He figured it out. Not all at once. The way you figure things out when no one teaches you directly, by doing the wrong thing enough times that the right thing becomes obvious. He learned that iron left on dirt rusts from the bottom up. So he started stacking it on salvaged wooden pallets he hauled from behind the hardware store. He learned to sort by shape and dimension. That flat bar and angle iron and square tube each wanted to be in a different pile, because the day you need a piece of angle iron, you don't want to dig through a wall of round stock to find it. He measured everything and wrote the dimensions on the end of each piece with a paint marker. He organized the pallets in rows with a walking path between them. From a distance, it still looked like a junkyard. Up close, it was a catalog. At 13, he welded his first real object, a garden cart frame, 4 wheels, drop-in sides. He gave it to Ruth because she'd been dragging bags of soil across the yard with her bad hip. She used it every spring for the rest of her life and never once said it was anything special, which was how she said most things were special. At 14, he sold his first piece to a stranger, a custom equipment bracket for a man who ran a small auto shop and couldn't source the right hardware through his supplier. The man found Tobias through a neighbor's recommendation. He paid $65. Tobias reinvested the money the same week into a used angle grinder with a cutoff wheel. That became the pattern. Build a piece, sell it, buy a better tool. He wasn't fast and he wasn't fancy, but he was precise in the way people are precise when they can't afford to waste material. The town watched with the particular interest small towns reserve for things they don't understand. He heard the comments. "Scrap heap. That rust kid." Someone spray-painted junkyard in faded orange letters on the fence post facing the county road, and it stayed there for 3 years because Tobias didn't bother removing it. Let them read it, he thought. Let them read it when they drive by. His grandmother's health began slipping when Tobias was 16. Not dramatically. The way a house settles. Gradually, almost imperceptibly, until one day you notice a door doesn't hang quite right anymore. She cut her hours at the dry cleaner to 2 days a week. She stopped going to the Friday night church dinners she had attended without interruption for 30 years. She moved slower between the kitchen and the living room, and sometimes in the morning she stayed in bed until 9, which she had never done in Tobias's memory. He didn't say anything about it. He just started doing the grocery shopping. He started cooking on the nights she didn't feel like it. He got a small engine repair certification from a Saturday program at the county extension office and started picking up jobs, lawnmowers, tillers, a riding mower that hadn't run in 6 years, that he could do in the evenings and on weekends, and the iron kept coming over the fence. Every Thursday, sometimes Tuesday, Pete had been replaced by a younger forklift driver whose name Tobias never learned. But the bins were the same and the material was the same, and Tobias kept carrying it back. By the time he was 18, the operation at the back of the Greer property had become something that didn't have a name yet but deserved one. He had a 30 by 40 foot shed he'd built himself over 2 summers out of offloaded lumber and corrugated steel roofing. Inside it, the flux core welder, now joined by a MIG welder he'd bought used and rebuilt, a bench grinder, a drill press, the angle grinder, 2 vises, a metal cutting bandsaw, and an acetylene torch he'd gotten from an estate sale for $40 and had inspected by a licensed welder before he touched it. Along both walls, the iron was sorted and stacked on custom-built steel shelving he'd fabricated himself, each section labeled in black paint marker by shape, size, and alloy where he could determine it. The shelving alone, made entirely from the plant's discarded material, would have cost $3,000 to buy new. He did not know that yet. He was about to find out. In the spring of 2025, Caldwell Fabrication was acquired by a regional manufacturing group called Vantage Industrial Partners. Vantage sent a man named Terrence Holt to Harwick to assess the operation and identify, in the language of the acquisition memo, areas of operational inefficiency. Terrence was 37. He wore a company fleece regardless of the weather. He walked the plant floor with a tablet and a habit of interrupting people mid-sentence to type a note. He found inefficiencies the way a metal detector finds coins, methodically, without emotion, and with a small beep of satisfaction each time. On his 4th day, he noticed the forklift driver moving bins toward the western fence instead of the main waste staging area. He stopped walking. "What's that?" The floor supervisor, a woman named Giselle Harmon, glanced over. "Old arrangement. The neighbor takes our drops." "What neighbor?" "The property next door. The family's been there since before the plant was built. Kid back there takes the scrap." Terrence typed a note. "What kid?" Giselle shrugged. "He's not really a kid anymore." Terrence pulled the property records that afternoon. Owner of record, Ruth Greer Estate, held in trust. Primary resident, Tobias Greer, age 23. He pulled the satellite view and saw the long shadow of what looked like a large outbuilding at the rear of the property. He pulled 5 years of disposal invoices and found the $900 a month, every month, through 2 ownership changes. Going to a hauler who apparently had never been given clear instructions to stop staging at the fence line. He looked at those invoices for a long time. Then he put on his company fleece and walked through the back gate. He found Tobias in the shed, cutting a length of square tube on the bandsaw. The saw noise covered the sound of Terrence's footsteps, so when it stopped, Tobias turned and found a stranger standing in his doorway with a tablet. Tobias set down the cut piece, wiped his hands on a shop rag. "Can I help you?" Terrence looked at the shed, at the machines, at the shelving. He was already reading from his notes. "Terrence Holt, Vantage Industrial. We've taken over Caldwell. I'm here about the arrangement you have with the plant regarding waste material." "It's not waste," Tobias said. "It's iron stock." Terrence smiled the way people smile when they're about to explain something. "Technically, under our current material classification, it's production residuals. What I'm here to discuss is formalizing the arrangement going forward. We'd like to designate a proper staging area, get a signed agreement in place, standard liability stuff. We'd pay you $75 a month for use of the strip along the fence." Tobias looked at the tablet in Terrence's hand, then at the shelving on the wall, then back at Terrence. "No," he said. The smile didn't waver. "I haven't finished explaining." "You finished," Tobias said. "Not unkind, just clear." Terrence reset. He'd been told no before. Not like this, not with this particular quality of quiet, but he'd been told no. He shifted to the secondary approach. Here's the situation. What's currently happening is an undocumented waste transfer. That's a compliance problem, for us and potentially for you. If we can't formalize it, we have to terminate it. 30-day notice, cease and desist. You clear the property or we petition the county to do it under the solid waste ordinance. He paused. I'm trying to give you a way to avoid that. Tobias picked up the length of square tube from the workbench, turned it in his hands. It was a piece that had come over the fence in 2017. He didn't know that. He didn't date the metal the way the video story's woodworker dated wood. What he did know was that it had come from the plant and that he had let it season, let the mill scale weather down, let it become the kind of material that behaves itself when you weld it. Do what you have to do, he said. Terrence stood there another moment. Nobody had briefed him on this outcome. He made a final note, gave a professional nod, and walked back across the yard. His company fleece left a slight fluorescent reflection in the shed's overhead light as he went through the gate. That night, Tobias sat at the kitchen table across from his grandmother's empty chair. Ruth had moved to an assisted living facility 8 months ago when her balance got bad enough that the doctor said living alone was a risk. The house was still hers on paper. Tobias paid the bills. He sat there in the dark and thought about what he had and what it was worth. He did not call a lawyer. He didn't know any lawyers. He called Jerome, his grandmother's cousin, a retired postal worker who had once helped Ruth sort out a boundary dispute with the city over a drainage easement. Jerome said the same thing he had said then. Write it all down, date, time, what they said, what you said, everything. Tobias wrote it all down. Then he went to the shed and started working on a set of custom machinery mounts he'd been commissioned to build for a small food processing operation in Macon. He worked until 2 in the morning. The cuts were clean. The welds were clean. He had gotten very good at his work over 15 years, and the work felt like something to hold on to. The certified letter came 4 days later. Law firm out of Atlanta. The language was what it was. Tobias read it once, left it on the table, went back to the shed. Over the next 3 weeks, he did something that confused everyone who could see it happening. He hired 2 men he knew from the technical college, both of them welders, both between jobs, and the 3 of them moved the entire exterior pile from the fence line into the shed and the additional covered storage he'd built the summer before. Every piece organized, shelved, logged. What had been a visible, sprawling, fence-length accumulation of iron became bare Georgia clay. From his office window, Terrence Holt watched the ground along the fence clear. He mentioned it to Giselle in passing. Looks like the neighbor took care of it. Giselle said. She had grown up 2 miles from the Greer property. She did not explain the sound she made. On the last day of the 3 weeks, Tobias put on the one button-down shirt he owned that wasn't a work shirt, drove to the Caldwell plant's administrative office, and asked the receptionist to let him speak to Terrence Holt. He had a folder under his arm. He waited 17 minutes. When Terrence came out, Tobias set the folder on the counter. Inside was a document he had written himself, checked against 3 online legal templates, and had reviewed by a paralegal he found through a legal aid clinic in Augusta who charged $40 for an hour of her time. It was an invoice. 15 years of production residuals transferred at market rate. Not scrap rate, not salvage rate, but published market rate for the specific alloys and shapes Tobias had logged, discounted 40% for irregular dimensions and varying quality. The total came to $218,000. From that figure, Tobias had subtracted the documented storage value, use of 2.8 acres for staged material, at a conservative per square foot rate for industrial land in Harwick County. That credit was $6,400. The invoice read, balance due to Tobias Greer, $211,600. Terrence read it the way people read things they don't want to be reading. His expression moved through several phases. He set the document down. You can't be serious, he said. He almost laughed. This material was classified as waste. You knew it was waste when you took it. I knew it was iron, Tobias said. I built a business with it. I have 15 years of records. He opened the folder to the next page. weight estimates by year based on the logs he'd kept, photos of the shelving system dated on the metadata, purchase receipts for every machine in the shed, revenue records from Carter Custom, from Greer Fabrication, the business he'd registered 3 years ago. Your company's own disposal contract shows $900 a month to haul material to recycling, he said. That material never left. It went 30 feet to the left. I processed it and sold it. I saved your company the hauling cost and turned their waste into taxable revenue. He slid a third page across the counter. I'm not looking for $211,000, he said. I'm looking for this. Terrence looked at the third page. It was not a number. It was a contract proposal. A 5-year agreement under which Greer Fabrication would purchase Caldwell's production residuals at a fixed rate per pound, above scrap value, below market, with a guaranteed volume minimum, the equivalent of a supply agreement. Vantage's waste stream would become Tobias's raw material, documented, legal, audited. Think about what it costs you to have someone else haul it, Tobias said. Terrence didn't answer right away. I need to see your records, he said. You can see my records, he drove back with Tobias. Through the gate, past the bare fence line, to the shed at the back of the property where the doors were open and the 2 welders Tobias had hired were finishing up an order of custom brackets for a commercial refrigeration company in Savannah. Terrence stopped inside the door. His company fleece caught the light from the overhead fixtures. The shed smelled of metal and flux and WD-40 and something warmer underneath, sawdust maybe, from the pallet wood in the walls. The machines were old. Every machine was clean and functional and set up correctly, with clear sight lines and a swept floor and tools hung on pegboard outlines so the missing ones were obvious at a glance. On the back wall, in painted black letters 3 inches high, was a single line. Good material finds its way to the right hands eventually. Terrence read it. He didn't say anything. Tobias walked him through the logbooks. Species by species was the wrong word here. Alloy by alloy, shape by shape, running totals that went back to when Tobias was 11 years old, and keeping records in a spiral notebook because someone had told him to write things down. The logs picked up in formality as the years went on, from pencil in a spiral notebook to pen in a proper ledger to a spreadsheet printed and filed in a 3-ring binder. You've been doing this since you were 11? Terrence said. It was not quite a question. Started collecting when I was 9, Tobias said. Didn't start writing it down until I was 11. The meeting that happened after that was not in Terrence's project plan. But it happened. Vantage's legal team reviewed the invoice and the contract proposal. They reviewed Tobias's records. They had their own lawyers look at the disposal documentation. The invoice for $211,600 was not paid. What happened instead was a negotiated settlement, $22,000 in cash, and a signed version of the supply contract Tobias had proposed, modified slightly in the language but not in the substance. Greer Fabrication would purchase Caldwell's production residuals at a documented per-pound rate with guaranteed quarterly minimums. Vantage would get a clean paper trail and a reduced disposal liability. Terrence wrote it up as a waste stream monetization initiative. He included it in his efficiency report. He was acknowledged in an internal memo for creative problem-solving. He did not quite understand, even then, who had been solving which problem. Tobias took the $22,000 and did not bank it. He called the 2 welders he'd hired for the move and offered them full-time positions. He ordered a used plasma cutter from an industrial auction in Tennessee. He spent 3 weeks building a second shed behind the first, larger, with better ventilation, and a concrete floor he poured himself with the help of a YouTube tutorial, and Jerome's nephew, who had some concrete experience and was available on weekends. He drove to Macon to deliver the refrigeration brackets in person, handed the production manager his business card, and asked if they had regular fabrication needs. They did. He put a photograph on the business's new social media page. The photo showed the interior of the shed, the machines, the shelving, the black painted line on the back wall. The caption said, "Built with 15 years of material other people didn't want." Within a week, the post had been shared more than he expected. Within a month, a reporter from the Augusta Chronicle had called. Within 6 months, Greer Fabrication had 7 employees, 2 active municipal contracts, and a supply agreement with a construction company that needed custom hardware faster than standard suppliers could deliver it. The business operated out of the 2.8 acres Amos Greer had bought in 1953 for $400 from a farmer leaving for Memphis. Ruth knew what was happening. Tobias told her on his Sunday visits, sitting in the good chair the facility had let her bring from home. She listened with her hands folded in her lap and asked questions that were sharper than they needed to be for someone who said she didn't understand business. The Sunday he told her about the supply contract. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Your grandfather would have had something annoying to say about this." "Like what?" "Like I told you so. He was very fond of that." She reached over and put her hand on his arm. Her hand was small and very dry and had not changed much from his earliest memory of it. "You didn't waste a single piece," she said. "No, ma'am, not even time." She turned back to her window. Outside, the assisted living facility's garden was doing what Georgia gardens do in spring, which is go green in a way that looks almost aggressive. She watched it for a while. "Go home," she said. "You've got work." He went home. He had work. The original shed still stands at the back of the Greer property, the one Tobias built at 18 out of salvaged lumber and corrugated roofing. He kept it the way it was, the pegboard, the painted line, the old flux core welder on its cart in the corner that he hasn't used in 2 years but hasn't moved either. Every new hire gets walked through it. Not as a museum piece, as a map. "This is where the thing started," the walk says. "This is what it looked like when it was one person in a shed working with what other people threw away." On the wall above the door, there is one framed piece of paper. It is the original invoice. 211s and $600, discounted to 22,000s in settlement. The line through the larger number is still visible. A client asked about it once. A man from a construction company in Atlanta, young, MBA, the kind of guy who calls everything a pivot. "What's the story behind that?" he asked. Tobias glanced at it. He did not tell the whole story. He said, "A man told me my inventory was garbage. I wanted to keep a record of what he thought it was worth." The client looked at the framed invoice, looked at the shed, looked at the 7 employees visible through the window of the newer building, cutting and welding and fitting custom hardware for projects across 2 states. He didn't say anything after that. Some things don't need a follow-up. There is probably something in your life that someone else has written off. A skill they called impractical. A habit they called a waste of time. A pile of something that has no obvious value until the person with 15 years of patience decides to add it up. The spreadsheet cannot measure what happens when the wrong person decides something is worthless and the right person decides to carry it home.